I never expected to become the proud owner of a century-old farmhouse. When my grandfather passed away last spring, leaving me his beloved property on the outskirts of Mapleton, I was both honored and overwhelmed. The Taylor family farmhouse had stood for over 100 years, weathering storms, economic downturns, and the gradual urbanization of the surrounding area. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What used to be acres of farmland was now the edge of the Willow Creek subdivision. Modern cookie-cutter homes with perfect lawns surrounding my grandfather's rustic 3-acre property like vultures circling their prey. But the farmhouse itself was a treasure. Hand-built wooden beams, a stone foundation, and windows that had witnessed a century of American history. I'd barely finished moving in when I received my first notice from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. It was printed on crisp lavender paper, the HOA logo embossed at the top in gold. The letter stated that my property was in violation of multiple community standards and demanded immediate action. I was confused. My grandfather's farm predated the subdivision by nearly a century. How could it possibly be subject to their rules? I called the number listed at the bottom of the notice, and that's when I first encountered Victoria Harrington, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of property values. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we're so glad you reached out. Your quaint little farm is simply not up to Willow Creek standards. The board has been patient with your grandfather for years. But now that ownership has changed hands, we expect compliance." I tried to explain that the farmhouse wasn't technically part of their subdivision, but Victoria wasn't interested in legal distinctions. "Your driveway connects to our roads, which means you benefit from our infrastructure," she insisted. "The peeling paint, that decrepit barn, and those hideous old farm implements in the yard are eyesores that bring down everyone's property values." I ended the call feeling uneasy, but determined to stand my ground. The following day, I visited the county records office and discovered something interesting. My grandfather's property was indeed separate from the Willow Creek subdivision, with its own distinct deed and property lines. According to the clerk, the HOA had no legal jurisdiction over my land. Armed with this knowledge, I wrote a polite but firm response to Victoria, including copies of the relevant documents. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I returned home from work to find a notice of violation taped to my front door. This one cited unauthorized agricultural elements, historical aesthetic clashing with community standards, and failure to submit exterior paint colors for approval. At the bottom was a fine for $750. I took photos of the notice and decided to do some research on Victoria Harrington. What I discovered was troubling. According to several community forum posts, Victoria had been using the HOA as her personal enforcement tool for years. One neighbor had been fined for planting native wildflowers instead of the approved turf grass. Another had fought a 6-month battle over the color of their mailbox. My blood was boiling, but I kept my cool. Instead of confronting Victoria directly, I sent a certified letter reiterating that my property was not subject to HOA rules, along with a formal request to cease and desist all enforcement actions. The next weekend, I was restoring one of the old wooden window frames when I noticed a group of people standing at the edge of my property. Victoria was there in her pressed khaki pants and polo shirt with the HOA logo, pointing at my house and gesturing emphatically to a man in a suit. I walked over to introduce myself. "Oh, Mr. Taylor," Victoria said with that plastic smile. "We were just discussing the community beautification plan. This is Mr. Davis from the County Planning Commission." I shook the man's hand and asked directly, "Are you aware that my property isn't part of the Willow Creek HOA?" Mr. Davis looked uncomfortable. I was told this was regarding subdivision improvements. Victoria, I said calmly, please stop misrepresenting your authority over my property. I have the documentation proving my grandfather's farm is not subject to your HOA rules. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened. We'll see about that, she said, before turning on her heel and walking away, the group of HOA board members following in her wake. That evening, I installed security cameras around my property. Something told me this wasn't over. I was right to be concerned. The following week, I received a letter from the county claiming my property had been reported for multiple code violations, including unsafe historical structures and improper agricultural use in a residential zone. The letter demanded I make extensive modifications or face significant penalties. This was escalating quickly, but I maintained my composure. I called the county office and scheduled an inspection, confident that my property was in compliance with all applicable codes. The inspector who arrived, Mark Jenkins, was fair and thorough. After walking the property, he confirmed what I already knew. Your grandfather kept this place in great shape, he said. The barn needs a few minor repairs to meet current safety codes, but nothing major. As for the zoning issue, you're grandfathered. In agricultural use is permitted since it predates the current zoning laws. So, I'm not in violation? I asked. Not of anything significant, Mark replied. I'll note the minor repairs needed, but this is nowhere near the level of violation that was reported. He hesitated, then added, between you and me, we get a lot of complaints from Mrs. Harrington. Most of them are overblown. That night, I felt a small sense of victory. The county was on my side, and I had documentation to prove it. But as I sat on my grandfather's old porch swing, watching the sunset over what remained of the farm fields, I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria wasn't finished with me yet. The relative peace lasted exactly 2 weeks. I was away for a weekend business trip when my phone alerted me to motion on my security cameras. I opened the app to see smoke pouring from my grandfather's old barn. My heart sank as I frantically called 911, explaining the situation and my absence from the property. By the time I raced home the following morning, the barn was a charred skeleton, and firefighters were still dousing hotspots. Chief Rodriguez met me at the property line. I'm sorry about your barn, Mr. Taylor, he said, removing his helmet. We contained it before it reached the house, but the barn is a total loss. What happened? I asked, staring at the smoldering ruins of a structure that had stood for over a century. The chief's expression darkened. We're investigating. But I'll be straight with you, this doesn't look accidental. There was an accelerant used. My mind immediately went to Victoria, but I kept those thoughts to myself for the moment. My security cameras might have captured something, I offered. We reviewed the footage together in my kitchen. The cameras had caught a figure in dark clothing approaching the barn just after midnight, carrying what looked like a gas can. The person's face was obscured, but the build and movement seemed familiar. I'll need a copy of this, Chief Rodriguez said. It's definitely arson. After he left, I went through the footage again, frame by frame. In one shot, as the figure turned toward the security light, I caught a glimpse of a distinctive gold pin on their jacket, the exact same HOA logo pin that Victoria wore to every community meeting. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough to raise serious suspicions. Still, I knew accusations without solid evidence would get me nowhere. Instead of confronting Victoria directly, I decided to build my case methodically. First, I contacted my insurance company and had them send their investigator. Then I reached out to Mark Jenkins at the county office to inform him of the fire and request another inspection of the property. I also hired a private investigator to look into Victoria's background and the HOA's history of enforcement actions. What the PI discovered was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Victoria had a pattern of targeting properties that didn't fit her vision of the perfect community. 3 years earlier, an elderly couple had been essentially forced to sell their modest home after relentless HOA violations made their lives miserable. The buyer? Victoria's sister-in-law, who purchased the property at well below market value. I also learned that Victoria had been vocal at several HOA meetings about wanting my grandfather's land for a community amenity center, a project that would boost her reputation and legacy as HOA president. Armed with this information, I consulted with an attorney who specialized in property disputes and HOA law. Matthew Simmons listened carefully to my story, reviewed my evidence, and smiled. "You've done excellent groundwork," he said. "The HOA has no legal standing here, and if we can connect Victoria to the arson, we're looking at criminal charges. But even without that, we have enough to build a civil case based on harassment, false claims to authorities, and potentially conspiracy." We decided on a multi-pronged approach. First, Matthew sent a formal legal notice to the entire HOA board. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Detailing the evidence of harassment and informing them that my property was legally exempt from their jurisdiction. We copied the county commissioners and local law enforcement. Next, we filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA and Victoria personally, citing harassment, attempted fraudulent enforcement, and creating a hostile living environment. We requested significant damages, including the cost of rebuilding the historic barn. The response was immediate. I received a call from Brian Murphy, the HOA's vice president, requesting an urgent meeting. When we met at my attorney's office, Brian was visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Taylor, we had no idea the extent of Victoria's zealousness regarding your property," he said. "The board never authorized many of the actions she took in our name. Yet you allowed it to continue," my attorney pointed out. Brian looked down at his hands. "We've called an emergency board meeting to address this. Victoria has been temporarily suspended from her position pending an internal investigation." This was a promising development, but I wasn't ready to drop the lawsuit. The destruction of my grandfather's barn deserved justice. 2 days later, local police arrested Victoria Harrington for arson. The evidence was damning, not only the security footage, but also receipts for accelerant purchased with her credit card and phone records showing she was in the vicinity of my property at the time of the fire. When faced with the evidence, Victoria's gardener confessed that she had paid him to start the fire, believing it would finally force me to sell the property. The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Neighbors I had never met came by to express their support and share their own stories of Victoria's tyranny. Many admitted they had been too intimidated to stand up to her before. The HOA board, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, proposed a settlement. They would pay for the complete restoration of my barn using historical preservation methods, cover all my legal fees, and formally acknowledge that my property was exempt from their jurisdiction. Additionally, they offered to create a buffer zone of green space between my land and the subdivision, protecting the farm's rural character. My attorney advised me to accept the settlement with one additional condition. I wanted a legally binding agreement that the HOA would reform its governance structure to prevent future abuses of power. The board readily agreed, likely more concerned about their own potential liability than actual reform. As I watched the carpenters begin work on rebuilding the barn using traditional methods and reclaimed materials from the same era, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My grandfather's legacy would continue, stronger than before. Victoria awaited trial for arson and fraud, facing serious jail time and civil penalties. In a twist that would have made my grandfather chuckle, the County Historical Society reached out about designating the farm as a protected historical site, a status that would permanently shield it from development and ensure its preservation for generations to come. The neighboring families, freed from Victoria's reign of terror, began stopping by to introduce themselves. Some even volunteered to help with the barn raising, turning it into a community event that harkened back to the farm's early days. As I sat on the porch swing one evening, watching fireflies dance over what remained of the old fields, I realized that Victoria's attempt to destroy my inheritance had actually saved it. The farmhouse wasn't just a building anymore. It had become a symbol of standing up to bullies and preserving what matters, regardless of who tries to burn it down. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just winning the battle, it's changing the entire landscape of the war. 6 months after the fire, I stood in the center of the newly rebuilt barn, inhaling the scent of fresh-cut timber and historical preservation. The reconstruction was almost complete, a perfect blend of modern safety standards and traditional craftsmanship. Local artisans had recreated the original joinery techniques, using wooden pegs instead of nails where possible, just as my grandfather would have wanted. The afternoon sun filtered through the hayloft window, casting warm patterns on the plank flooring that echoed the original 100-year-old design. "Mr. Taylor?" a voice called from the doorway. It was Emma Chen, the county's historical preservation officer. She'd been instrumental in helping obtain the proper materials and documentation for the restoration. "The designation committee just called. They've unanimously approved your application. The Taylor Farm is now officially a registered historical landmark." I felt a lump form in my throat as I walked over and shook her hand. "Thank you. My grandfather would have been proud." Emma smiled, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "The designation comes with tax benefits and, more importantly, permanent protection from development. No one can force changes to the property's historical character now, not developers, not the city, and certainly not any homeowners association." After Emma left, I wandered through the property, taking in how much had changed in half a year. The main farmhouse had been carefully restored, its weathered clapboard siding repaired rather than replaced, preserving the patina that only comes with age. The handmade shutters had been rehung, and the stone foundation repointed by a mason who specialized in historical techniques. But it wasn't just the buildings that had transformed. The land itself felt different. Where once there had been tension with the neighboring subdivision, there was now a thoughtfully designed buffer zone of native trees and wildflower meadows. The HOA, under its new leadership, had followed through on their promise to create green space between the developments, yielding a natural transition that benefited everyone. My phone buzzed with a news alert. I pulled it out to see Victoria Harrington's face on the screen. The verdict in her trial had come in. Guilty on all counts: arson, fraud, conspiracy, and criminal property damage. The judge had sentenced her to 5 years, with 3 years suspended plus restitution. The article noted that 3 other HOA board members had also pleaded guilty to lesser charges of harassment and abuse of authority. I pocketed my phone, feeling oddly hollow. The victory should have been satisfying, but instead I found myself reflecting on the waste of it all, the time, the resources, the community trust that had been shattered by one person's obsession with control. Victoria's need to impose her vision had not only destroyed a historic structure, but had also ruined her own life and reputation. As the sun began to set, I made my way to the farmhouse porch, where neighbors were gathering for what had become a weekly tradition: Friday evening potlucks. It had started spontaneously during the barn reconstruction, when people would bring food for the volunteer workers, and had evolved into something more meaningful, a genuine community. Mark Jenkins, the county inspector who had first stood up. For me, waved from where he was helping set up folding tables. "Just heard about the historical designation," he called. "Congratulations." Brian Murphy, the former HOA vice president, now heading the reformed board, approached with a casserole dish. "Mind if I join?" he asked, still slightly hesitant, despite having become a regular at these gatherings. "Always welcome," I replied, taking the dish from him. Our relationship had evolved from adversarial to cautiously friendly. Brian had been making genuine efforts to transform the HOA from an enforcement entity into a true community organization. As more neighbors arrived, some from the subdivision, others from nearby farms, I found myself watching their interactions with a sense of wonder. Elizabeth, a retired teacher from Willow Creek, was deep in conversation with old Joe from the cattle ranch down the road, two people who, before the fire, would likely never have crossed paths. Children played tag around the old oak tree, regardless of which side of the invisible property line they came from. Sarah Williams, who had moved into the subdivision just after the Victoria scandal broke, set down a plate of cookies and sat beside me on the porch swing. "I've been meaning to ask," she said, "what made you fight so hard? Most people would have sold and moved somewhere less complicated." I considered her question, watching the golden evening light play across the fields my grandfather had tended. For decades. At first it was about principle, standing up to a bully, then it became about justice after the fire. But somewhere along the way, it transformed into something bigger. "How so?" I gestured toward the gathering. "Look around. Before all this happened, this was just land with buildings on it. The subdivision was just houses where people slept. None of this existed. This community, these connections." Sarah nodded. "It's strange how destruction sometimes creates space for something new to grow." As the evening progressed and lanterns were lit around the yard, I found myself drawn to the small family cemetery at the edge of the property. 4 generations of Taylors rested there, including my grandfather. His simple headstone stood solid in the twilight, the recently planted rosebush beside it already thriving. "I think I finally understand," I said quietly to his stone. It was never really about the buildings, was it? The lessons my grandfather had tried to teach me during summers on the farm suddenly took on new meaning. He'd always said that land wasn't just dirt and crops. It was a responsibility to something greater than yourself. When he left me the farm, he wasn't just passing on property, he was entrusting me with a legacy of stewardship and community. I'd been so focused on preserving the physical structures that I'd almost missed the deeper heritage, the way the farm had always served as a gathering place, a center for the community that had existed before subdivisions and property lines. In fighting for the buildings, I'd inadvertently restored something far more valuable that had been slowly fading away before the fire ever happened. The next morning, I woke early and walked the perimeter of the property as the sun rose. The light caught dewdrops on spiderwebs strung between fence posts, hundreds of them, each a perfect, intricate structure invisible until illuminated. It struck me as the perfect metaphor for what had happened here. The invisible connections between people, only revealed when circumstances aligned just right. I'd received a settlement check from the HOA's insurance the previous week, substantially more than required for the rebuilding. My lawyer had advised investing it, but standing there in the morning mist, I knew there was a better use for those funds. By noon, I'd sketched out plans for the Taylor Farm Community Foundation. The mission was simple: to preserve not just historical structures, but also the rural heritage and agricultural knowledge that was being lost as farms gave way to developments. The foundation would offer workshops on traditional crafts, sustainable farming practices, and historical preservation techniques. We'd host school groups and provide scholarships for young people interested in sustainable agriculture. When I shared the idea at the town council meeting that evening, the response was overwhelming. The mayor immediately offered to partner on grant applications. The Agricultural Extension Office volunteered expertise. Even the reformed HOA board unanimously voted to support the initiative with annual contributions. "We could start with the spring planting," suggested Mrs. Thompson, who had gardened all her life. "Show kids where food actually comes from." "And I could lead workshops on historical building methods," offered Jim Peterson, the master carpenter who had supervised the barn restoration. By the meeting's end, we had a dozen volunteers and a clear vision. What had begun as a personal battle had evolved into a community mission that bridged the divide between old and new, rural and suburban. The very conflict that had threatened to destroy my inheritance had instead revealed its true purpose. 3 weeks later, I stood before a group of elementary school children visiting the farm on their first field trip. They clustered around me in the barn, eyes wide with curiosity, as I showed them hand tools that had belonged to my great-grandfather. "This farm is over 100 years old," I explained, "but it almost disappeared forever. Sometimes the most important things in our lives are the most fragile." A small girl in overalls raised her hand. "Is that why you rebuilt it? Because it's important?" I smiled, thinking about how to answer in terms a child could understand. "I rebuilt it because I finally realized what makes a place special isn't just how old it is or what it looks like. It's the memories we create here, the things we learn, and the people we share it with." Later that afternoon, as the last school bus pulled away, I noticed a familiar car coming up the drive. It was Matthew Simmons, my attorney, whom I hadn't seen since the settlement was finalized. He got out, holding a large manila envelope. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing it to me. "Just came across my desk this morning." Inside was a letter from the State Department of Corrections. Victoria Harrington was requesting community service in lieu of the remainder of her sentence. Specifically, she was asking to work with historical preservation projects. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, frowning at the document. Matthew shrugged. I had the same reaction, but her therapist included a note. "Apparently, Victoria has had some genuine revelations about the damage her behavior caused. The therapist thinks meaningful restoration work might be part of her rehabilitation." I sat down on a nearby bench, trying to process this unexpected development. My first instinct was anger. After everything she'd done, how dare she try to insert herself into the very community she'd tried to destroy? But beneath the anger was something more complicated, a recognition that the cycle of destruction and restoration might not be complete yet. "You don't have to decide anything now," Matthew said, "and you certainly don't owe her anything. I just thought you should know." After he left, I walked to the highest point on the property, a gentle rise that overlooked both the farm and the subdivision beyond. The afternoon light painted everything in warm amber tones, softening the distinctions between old and new. From this vantage point, it was impossible to see where one community ended and another began. The Foundation's first workshop was scheduled for the following weekend, traditional fence building, with participants from both the rural areas and the subdivision. The waitlist had grown so long, we'd had to schedule 3 additional sessions. People were hungry for connection, for knowledge, for something authentic in a world that increasingly valued uniformity over character. I thought about Victoria's request, turning it over in my mind as the sun began to set. Perhaps there was wisdom in completing the circle, allowing the person who had sought to destroy history to participate in preserving it. Not for her sake, but for the sake of the larger restoration that was happening here. My grandfather had always said that good land forgives bad farmers. Maybe good communities could forgive those who had failed to understand their value, not with blind trust, but with cautious opportunity for genuine amends. I pulled out my phone and composed a careful email to the corrections department. Victoria could start with supervised community service at the foundation, not working directly with me, but contributing to the larger mission. Everyone deserved the chance to rebuild, even those who had once set fires. As darkness fell, I made my way back to the farmhouse, where lights glowed warmly from windows that had witnessed a century of changes. The newly installed weather vane, a hand-forged replica of the original, creaked gently as it turned in the evening breeze, finding its orientation just as the community around it was finding its new direction. What had begun as a battle over property had evolved into something far more meaningful. A reclamation not just of buildings and land, but of the very idea of community itself. The HOA had burned my inherited farmhouse, but from those ashes had risen something they could never have anticipated. A living testament to the fact that what truly matters can never be reduced to property values or architectural guidelines. The final realization wasn't about winning or losing a neighborhood dispute. It was that preservation isn't just about saving things from the past. It's about creating the conditions for something valuable to continue into the future, transformed but undiminished. The farmhouse now stood not as a relic, but as a bridge between past and future, between different ways of life, between people who might otherwise never have found common ground. As I stepped onto the porch, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the creak of the floorboards. "The land always wins in the end, son. Our job is just to listen to what it's trying to become." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.